very fast. So, the 9,924th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for the meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Czechia, Estonia, Iceland, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, and Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director of Financing and Partnership Division, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. And I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Thank you, Mr. President. When I last briefed this Council on developments in Ukraine exactly 1 month ago, there was cautious hope of progress on the diplomatic front to stop the fighting. Regrettably, instead of steps toward peace, we witnessed a brutal surge in large-scale Russian attacks across the country. This escalation comes after a relative reduction in the intensity of attacks, including the unilateral 72-hour truce declared by the Russian Federation from 8 to 11 May. For 3 consecutive nights last weekend, Russian armed forces attacked Ukrainian cities and towns with record numbers of long-range missiles and drones, killing and injuring dozens of civilians. Most of the casualties were recorded in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Mykolaiv, as well as in other densely populated areas. On Monday, 26 May, at least 6 people were reportedly killed and 24 injured across the country, including in Donetsk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Odessa, and Mykolaiv regions. According to Ukrainian officials, with 355 drones, Monday's attack was the largest drone attack on Ukraine since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. This topped the previous record from the night before. On Sunday, 25 May, 12 people, including 3 children, were reportedly killed and more than 60 others were injured when missiles and drones hit Kyiv and other locations in the Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Khmelnytskyi, Ternopil, Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Cherkasy, Sumy, and Poltava regions. More than 80 residential buildings were reportedly damaged. On Saturday, 24 May, at least 15 people, including 2 minors, were reportedly injured in a Russian strike on Kyiv. Elsewhere, at least 13 people were reportedly killed, 4 people in the Donetsk region, 5 in the Kherson and Odessa regions, and 4 in the Kharkiv region. The Dnipro and Zaporizhia regions were also hit. In addition, Sumy region in the northeast of Ukraine has been hit particularly hard by continuous cross-border heavy shelling. On 17 May, only hours after Russian and Ukrainian delegations met in Istanbul, a Russian drone strike on a civilian bus in Bielopolya in Sumy region reportedly killed 9 people and injured 7 others. Among those killed were 3 members of the same family, a mother, a father, and their daughter. In total, since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, at least 13,279 civilians, including 707 children, have been killed. The confirmed number of civilians injured stands at 32,449, including 2,068 children. The overall security situation so far in 2025 is significantly worse than in the same period last year. Civilian deaths in the first quarter of this year are 59% higher than in the same period of 2024. Mr. President, since my last briefing, Russian regions bordering Ukraine also reported civilian casualties. According to the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 9 civilians were killed and 117 were injured because of Ukrainian strikes from 19 to 25 May. The ministry also reported that from 12 to 18 May, 17 Russian civilians were killed and more than 100 others were injured following Ukrainian attacks on Russian border regions, bringing the total for the month of May to 59 killed, including 5 children, and more than 400 others injured, including 21 children. The United Nations is not able to verify these reports. However, if confirmed, these figures serve as a vivid reminder of the rising civilian toll of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, most egregiously in Ukraine, but also increasingly in the Russian Federation itself. Let me reiterate clearly. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. They are unacceptable and indefensible wherever they occur, and they must stop immediately. My colleague Lisa Dutton of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs will provide updates about the impacts of the renewed attacks on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and our response to deliver life-saving aid to all those in need. Mr. President, the latest dangerous escalation follows some significant diplomatic developments. On 16 May, Ukrainian and Russian delegations met in Istanbul for the first direct negotiations in 3 years. We welcome these talks and commend the important role of Turkey and the United States in facilitating these discussions. While the talks did not result in the much-needed, complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire that the Secretary General has called for, it is encouraging that the sides have reportedly agreed to continue the process. We also welcome an important result of these talks, the recently completed phased exchange of 1,000 prisoners of war on each side. We hope that all remaining prisoners of war and civilian detainees will soon return home. Mr. President, throughout the war, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported on the human rights violations in the territories of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation. The Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, meanwhile, continues to investigate alleged violations and abuses of human rights and international humanitarian law in Ukraine. Just yesterday, the Commission reported on allegations of systematic drone attacks by Russian forces targeting civilians in Kherson. The impact of the war on children is particularly heartbreaking. More than 5.1 million children have been displaced from their homes. 1 in 5 children has lost a relative or friend since 2022. And the fate of Ukrainian children reportedly deported to the Russian Federation remains a question of deep concern. Mr. President, the massive wave of attacks over the weekend is a stark warning of how quickly this war can reach new destructive levels. Further escalation would not only aggravate the devastating toll on civilians, but also endanger the already challenging peace efforts. The longer the war continues, the longer its regional and global impacts will be felt, and the more difficult it will be to find a peaceful resolution. The United Nations position has been and remains principled in support of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We continue to call for peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions. In February, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2774, the first since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, imploring a swift end to the conflict and urging a lasting peace. And soon after the passage of the resolution, after more than 3 years of brutal illegal war, the global community was heartened by what appeared to be the first sprouts of a potential peace process. However, anticipation and excitement quickly gave way to frustration around the world and more suffering in Ukraine following the recent and massive Russian attacks. The hope that the parties will be able to sit down and negotiate is still alive, but just barely. Serious, demonstrable, and good faith efforts are needed now to get back on the road that could lead to a just peace. A full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire is such an effort, if only an initial one. A peace process will not be easy, and it will take time, but it must not wait. The people of Ukraine, especially, cannot wait. Thank you.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Lisa Doughton. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Since our last update to this Council 1 month ago, attacks have continued to exact a staggering toll on civilians in Ukraine. Over just the past week, the humanitarian consequences have worsened, marked by forced displacement, the destruction of essential infrastructure, and the disruption of basic services. Despite peace talks earlier this month, a series of airstrikes and other hostilities, especially over this past weekend, caused civilian casualties across Ukraine, including the killing of 3 children. According to the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, at least 14 civilians were killed and over 39 injured. The attacks also caused extensive damage to civilian infrastructure, homes and schools, including in densely populated areas. Healthcare services remain under severe strain, particularly in the frontline areas of Kharkiv and Donetsk regions. These disruptions are limiting access to trauma care and other critical services, putting the sick and injured at serious risk. The World Health Organization has now verified more than 200 attacks affecting healthcare facilities, personnel, transport, supplies, and patients across Ukraine in 2025. Mr. President, civilians continue to face constant and grave dangers, particularly in the east, the south, and along the northern border regions. Missile and drone attacks over the past week have caused extensive civilian casualties and damaged residential buildings and essential infrastructure, including gas pipelines, schools, and public transport across at least 10 regions far from the front line, including Kyiv, Zhytomyr, and Helsinki. These incidents underscore the continued vulnerability of civilians nationwide, including the more than 3.7 million people currently displaced across Ukraine. This past week alone, more than 5,000 people, mainly from Kherson, Donetsk, and Sumy regions, were newly displaced as violence escalated. According to unverified reports, civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure were also recorded in the Kursk and Belgorod regions of the Russian Federation. As the Secretary General reaffirmed earlier this week, and as we have said multiple times before, under international humanitarian law, constant care must be taken to spare civilian and civilians' objects. Mr. President, the war continues to have a disproportionate impact on women and girls, particularly in these forcibly displaced areas. Risks of gender-based violence remain high, with ongoing demand for protection services outpacing available support, especially in some frontline areas. The dangers also remain high for humanitarian workers. So far in 2025, 37 incidents of violence impacting humanitarian personnel, assets, and facilities have been recorded. 2 aid workers have been killed and 23 have been injured while delivering assistance. Again, under international humanitarian law, humanitarian workers and assets must be protected. We remain gravely concerned about the 1.5 million civilians in areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia currently under occupation by the Russian Federation. These communities remain largely out of reach for humanitarian actors, not due to lack of capacity or will, but because of persistent impediments to humanitarian access. International humanitarian law is unequivocal. All parties must allow and facilitate the rapid, unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need. Obstructions that leave the civilian population without the essentials to survive run contrary to this obligation. Mr. President, despite escalating challenges, humanitarian partners, many of them local NGOs, continue to deliver vital assistance. This includes food, clean water, hygiene kits, and protection services for civilians living near the front line, those in the process of evacuating, and the most vulnerable among the internally displaced. In support of local emergency teams, emergency programs have also been carried out in the aftermath of recent attacks. Over the weekend, the humanitarian coordinator, Matthias Schmale, and OCHA led an interagency convoy to frontline communities in the Kherson region, where daily shelling continues to threaten civilians, many of whom are older persons. During the visit, he met residents who have chosen to remain despite the risks, holding on to hope that even after 3 years of hostilities in the area, life in their home communities would return to normal. The convoy delivered dignity kits for older people, as well as first aid kits, hygiene, and food kits. So far this year, 10 interagency convoys have reached nearly 14,000 people along the front line in Kherson. The humanitarian response continues to serve as a vital lifeline for millions. Since the beginning of 2025, 440 humanitarian organizations, mainly local NGOs, have provided life-saving assistance to approximately 3.1 million people across Ukraine. However, we're now more than 5 months into the year, and due to the sharp contraction in humanitarian funding, only a quarter of the $2.6 billion required for the 2025 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan has been received. Funding shortfalls have already forced reductions in cash assistance, mental health support, shelter assistance, and services for survivors of gender-based violence. Without urgent support, core programs risk being suspended just as needs are arising. Mr. President, let me conclude with 3 urgent messages. First, protect civilians and civilian objects. Attacks directed against homes, hospitals, and IDP shelters must stop, as must all indiscriminate attacks. Second, facilitate sustained humanitarian access. Humanitarian actors must be granted safe, rapid, and unimpeded access to all civilians in need, wherever they are, and regardless of which party controls the territory. We will persist in our engagement with the parties to this effect. The Council and all member states have much influence to exert to ensure both the protection of civilians and unimpeded humanitarian access. Third, support the humanitarian response. Lives depend on it. Every delay costs lives. Every dollar helps us reach the next family under fire with aid, educate the next child out of school, help evacuate people with disabilities, and sustain water in frontline communities. Mr. President, there's no respite for civilians in Ukraine. The bombs do not stop. The trauma does not subside. The needs do not shrink. And so our resolve cannot falter. Thank you.
I thank Mrs. Doughton for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Under-Secretary General Di Carlo and Director Doughton for their briefings. As the briefers have both highlighted, much has happened since this Council last convened to discuss Ukraine 1 month ago. Allow me to focus on a few major points. First, on the humanitarian situation. We welcome last weekend's largest prisoner exchange since Russia's full-scale invasion and commend to Kiev for their continued efforts. However, we cannot ignore the striking fact that while these exchanges were underway, Russia dramatically increased its aerial attacks against Ukraine's civilians and cities. In the past 2 weeks alone, Russia has fired over 1,000 drones, as well as ballistic and cruise missiles on Ukraine's population. Scenes of Kiev ablaze, of buses hit while evacuating civilians, of children in the wreckage are haunting reminders of the sheer brutality of this war. Even more cynical is the fact that some of these most deadly attacks took place while President Zelensky was himself in Turkey, ready and willing to engage in ceasefire talks. Such an escalation in attacks on civilians is completely incompatible with Putin's claimed desire for peace. As the Danish Prime Minister said on Monday, during the day, Putin talks about negotiations, then he bombs Ukraine during the night. Second, Mr. President, on the efforts to achieve a ceasefire, we have seen the victim of this aggression, Ukraine, repeatedly offer a comprehensive, immediate and unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Meanwhile, Putin has not engaged seriously in any talks. This playbook is well known by now. When the international pressure increases, Putin offers a symbolic ceasefire of a few days. We saw this for Easter or the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. His forces then engaged in widespread violations, exposing the true and empty nature of these promises. Just yesterday, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine published a report concluding that Russian armed forces have been systemically committing crimes against humanity by hunting civilians using remote-controlled drones. Mr. President, rather than engage in good faith negotiations, Russia has simply reissued the same maximalist demands that Russia knows will end talks before they even begin, curbing Ukraine's right to defend itself, violating Ukraine's territorial integrity and international recognized borders, offering no repatriations for the hundreds of billions of dollars of damage Russia has inflicted across Ukraine. Ukraine cannot be expected to accept terms that amount to its full capitulation and subjugation. Let there be no doubt, these demands are completely unacceptable. They are simply distraction, smokescreens to buy time and continue the killing. Mr. President, in closing, it is now high time for Russia to come to the negotiation table to engage seriously. As a start, Denmark calls for an immediate 30-day ceasefire. Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine until a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter is achieved. Ukraine must be free to decide its own future. There must be accountability for the terrible and widespread suffering its people have endured. We cannot and we will not remain silent in the face of this suffering and this dramatic escalation. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
President, at the outset, I'd like to thank USG, Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, as well as Lisa Dalton, Director of OCHA. Thank you for your briefings. President, every day, Russia chooses to continue its attack on Ukraine. No narrative can conceal this blatant fact. There can be no excuse to justify it. The people who are dying day in, day out in this war are the victims of a deliberate, renewed, and unjustifiable choice being made by Moscow. A ceasefire in Ukraine is something everyone is clamoring for. Everyone except Russia. Only Russia is impeding this process. 1 month ago, in this very chamber, with the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France, Jean-Noël Barrot, present, all members of the Security Council, except Russia, called for an end to hostilities. Ukraine recalled that starting from the 11th of March, it had been ready to accept an immediate, complete, and unconditional ceasefire. What's happened since then? Ukraine reaffirmed that it was ready to end hostilities. The Ukrainians have been saying this across the board, including at the highest political level. President Zelensky reiterated in Kiev on the 10th of May this very fact, together with the leaders of Germany, France, Poland, and the UK. Once again, the Russian president dodged the issue. Once again, he refused to end his attacks. To divert attention and to deliberately prolong the carnage, he called for direct negotiations in Istanbul, which he did not attend. President Zelensky was there, in Turkey, waiting for President Putin. Everyone knows this. In response to ceasefire proposals, the Russian Federation did not respond with a willingness to partake in real peace negotiations. Russia's vague engagements made to continue discussions. Whereas from Ukraine, in Ukraine, we saw on Russia's part contempt for the fate of civilians and human lives, with the deliberate targeting of civilian objects in violation of IHL, a record number of missiles and combat drones, as well as unabashed inflexibility on the part of the Kremlin as it pursued its objectives at a time when war crimes and crimes against humanity are being committed, as documented by the recent report of the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. President, let's hone in on the adjective unconditional, because it's vital for this Council to have a common understanding of what that means, a common definition. What does that mean, an unconditional ceasefire? This entails, and in fact, Ukraine has shown itself to be willing to do so since the 11th of March. It entails stopping the hostilities immediately, without any conditions. It is not the way Russia sees it. That is, a possible end to hostilities with an unspecified time frame, which hinges on a peace agreement being signed that's tantamount to a capitulation on the part of the attacked party. What does it mean, starting unconditional peace talks? It means accepting to participate in discussions which are not subject to any conditions. This is what Ukraine has been doing and did in Istanbul on the 16th of May, accepting direct negotiations with Russia without any prerequisites for a ceasefire. It's not about setting maximalist conditions. Yet, this is how the Russian Federation interpreted this in Istanbul on the 16th of May, when Russia demanded for Ukraine to withdraw its troops from the Ukrainian regions of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Let me repeat, on the 12th of October 2022, the General Assembly of the United Nations condemned the so-called, and I quote, attempted illegal annexation of the aforementioned territories by the Russian Federation. President, France stands ready, shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine and its partners, ready to initiate in a virtuous process of discussions about a peace plan. France stands side by side with the Ukrainian people to provide it with the humanitarian assistance it needs. The Russian Federation has no credibility when it claims to negotiate in good faith, all the while intensifying its strikes on Ukrainian territory. For this reason, the Security Council must demand a complete, immediate and unconditional ceasefire.
La démilitarisation de l'Ukraine n'est pas une condition préalable. Ni un objectif des pourparlers de paix. L'agresseur ne peut exiger, avant de mettre fin à son agression, que l'agressé renonce à son droit à la légitime défense que lui confère la Charte des Nations Unies. Une paix juste, solide et durable, telle que demandée à de multiples reprises par l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies, impliquera des garanties de sécurité robustes et crédibles pour l'Ukraine. L'Ukraine doit pouvoir choisir son avenir. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank USG DiCarlo and Director Doughton for briefing us today. Colleagues, we convene today to address the situation in Ukraine as we collectively mourn the lives lost due to Russia's recent attacks. This weekend saw two of the largest mass air attacks of the war, back to back. Over 3 days, Russia launched over 900 drones and missiles at Ukrainian cities, reportedly resulting in the deaths of 30 people and injuring a further 150. And these deaths were not an accident. Russia's missile and drone strikes struck major urban centres and densely populated regions. Over the night of 24 May, among those killed were 3 children, specifically 3 siblings. Stanislav, aged 8, Tamara, aged 12, and Roman, aged 17. Each of them on the edge of a new chapter of childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. All of them robbed of life too soon. Such acts are a stark reminder of the urgent need to bring this war to an end. Russia's attacks are not only sustained, they are worsening. As OHCHR has verified, in the first 3 months of this year alone, there have been 2,641 civilian casualties. That's nearly 900 more than during the same period in 2024, and over 600 more than early 2023. The increased killing of civilians is an affront to our shared values of human dignity and peace. Values which President Putin claims to share, yet continues to violate. Putin's priorities are demonstrated by his timing. These attacks were launched days after talks in Istanbul, in which Russia, yet again, refused to agree to an unconditional ceasefire. Presented with another opportunity for meaningful progress towards peace, Putin chose war. President, while Ukraine stands ready for an unconditional ceasefire, Russia sustains its aggression. And once again, innocent civilians are paying the price. Russia's actions speak much louder than its words. So we call on Russia to comply with international law, including the UN Charter, and to stop the killing of innocent civilians. Russia's unrelenting invasion of its sovereign neighbour will only redouble our resolve to help Ukraine defend itself and to use the necessary measures to restrict Putin's war machine. We will work in unison with the US, Ukraine, our European and international partners, until a just and lasting peace is no longer an aim, but an enduring reality. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you also for convening this meeting that Slovenia called for with other members of the Council from Europe. Mr. President, I would also like to thank the briefers, Under Secretary General De Carlo and Director Doughton. We need an end to the fighting in Ukraine, an end to civilian death, displacement, and deportation of children, an end to destruction of schools, hospitals, and houses. With hopes for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, Slovenia continues to support the ongoing diplomatic efforts. Meanwhile, however, Ukraine and its population are enduring a relentless barrage of aerial attacks. As we just heard from Under-Secretary General De Carlo, last weekend Russia launched a wave of large-scale airstrikes, hundreds of drones and missiles raining down on Ukrainian cities in the overnight attacks. The airstrikes on May 26 were the single largest aerial attack since the war began. I know other colleagues have said that before, but I think it's always good to repeat the largest attack since the war began, with no other apparent aim than to cause destruction of civilian infrastructure and install fear and terror in civilian population. All of this happened just before the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry concluded that the drone attacks by Russian armed forces around Kherson last year amount to crimes against humanity of murder. Slovenia condemns these attacks in the strongest possible terms. They represent a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. These attacks seem to represent nothing else but a big country, an aggressor, flexing its muscles over its smaller neighbor. Display of bad faith amidst of diplomatic efforts. Mr. President, with death and destruction on the rise, the need for diplomacy is obvious. Slovenia welcomes all contacts between Ukraine and Russia, like the Istanbul peace talks in mid-May. We welcome the agreement on the POW exchange in this regard. We underline, however, that the overall outcome is underwhelming. Russia has been claiming it wants peace for a very long time, but its actions speak otherwise. It has torpedoed all efforts towards stopping the fighting. It met Ukrainians' efforts towards a full ceasefire only with demands and conditions. To any onlooker, the situation is obvious. Ukraine is ready to silence the guns. Russia is not. Mr. President, we need a lasting and verifiable ceasefire that can pave the way to negotiations on enduring peace in Ukraine. With this in mind, Slovenia calls on Russia to stop hesitating and agree to a full and unconditional ceasefire. Ukraine and entire Europe want and need peace, not war, but peace. A peace that lasts and a peace that is just, a peace that is firmly anchored in the UN Charter and its principles. It is our duty to provide Ukraine with an opportunity to achieve it. Only this way, Ukrainians and their country can start to heal and hope for a better tomorrow. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I also would like to extend my gratitude to USG DiCarlo and Director Dutton for their timely briefings. I also welcome the representative of Ukraine to today's meeting. We are meeting today at a critical juncture of both fragile promise and alarming peril. Indeed, 2 weeks ago, after nearly 3 years, Russia and Ukraine resumed ceasefire negotiations, a significant step made possible largely due to the steadfast mediation efforts led by the United States. Of particular note, both sides agreed to the exchange of 1,000 prisoners each, and this swap was successfully concluded on Sunday. This was one of the largest humanitarian measures since the onset of the war, offering deep solace to countless families who have endured prolonged separation. We earnestly hope that this will serve, however small, as a stepping stone toward building trust between the two warring parties. However, the path toward comprehensive and lasting peace still appears distant. As today's briefers have already explained in detail, just days after these negotiations, Russia launched hundreds of sustained, large-scale drone and missile attacks across Ukraine, killing and injuring innocent civilians and destroying homes, schools, and other infrastructure. Let us be clear once again that these unjustifiable attacks serve as a grim reminder the words alone will not stop the war, only action will. We reiterate that such massive and indiscriminate attacks against civilian infrastructure constitute clear violations of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Ukraine has already stated its agreement to a full and immediate ceasefire. It is now Russia's turn to demonstrate its true sincerity and political will, not just through words, but through concrete actions. The reality is that negotiations cannot proceed in good faith while missiles and drones are continuously bombarding Ukraine cities. Partial or fleeting time constraints will not suffice. What is needed now is a complete and immediate cessation of hostilities. That is the only way to protect civilians and create the space for lasting diplomacy. We can no longer afford any further delay. Mr. President, as we have consistently emphasized, the war in Ukraine is not a distant or irrelevant conflict for the Republic of Korea. The large-scale transfer of arms and the deployment of 15,000 North Korean troops constitute a flagrant violations of multiple resolutions and the UN Charter. This collusion between Russia and North Korea not only seriously undermines international law and global norms, but also deteriorates global non-proliferation regime and directly threatens the lives and the security of innocent people in both Ukraine and the Korean Peninsula. Regrettably, it is no longer surprising that North Korean ballistic missiles are being used to kill and injure civilians in Ukraine. Furthermore, potential military assistance from Russia to North Korea and the combat experience being acquired by North Korean troops pose a serious and growing threat to the people of the Republic of Korea as well. As such, the illegal military cooperation between Russia and North Korea, in blatant violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions, must cease immediately. Mr. President, we urge all members of this Council to speak with one voice to demand an immediate and full cessation of hostilities and to insist the negotiations proceed in a manner that upholds the UN Charter and the international law. The longer this war continues, the harder it will be to repair the damage to lives, to livelihoods, and to international peace. In this connection, we implore the international community to maintain the momentum needed to continue to push for an end to this senseless war, ensuring that both a ceasefire and peace are ultimately achieved. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General DiCarlo and Ms. Lisa Doughton for their insightful briefings. Pakistan remains deeply concerned by the devastating humanitarian and security consequences of the Ukraine conflict that has been raging for over 4 years now. Despite the hopeful momentum generated by diplomatic initiatives, including Security Council Resolution 2774, ceasefire understandings, and negotiations facilitated by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, we are alarmed by the recent reports of intensification of hostilities. This escalation, marked by increased attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, undermines the fragile progress achieved through painstaking diplomacy. Mr. President, I would like to make the following 3 points in this context. First, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental obligation under international law, including the international humanitarian law. Pakistan deplores the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure under any pretext. All parties to conflict must uphold these principles without exception. Second, military means cannot resolve this conflict. Every day of continued hostilities deepens the suffering of civilians, distancing the parties further from a negotiated settlement. Pakistan reiterates its firm belief that only dialogue and diplomacy can deliver sustainable peace. Third, the fragile foundation of peace laid down by the diplomatic efforts needs consolidation. We welcome the direct talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, including agreements on prisoner exchanges, as steps in the right direction. However, these efforts are being overshadowed by the worsening situation on the ground. Diplomatic channels must not be abandoned in favor of escalation. Instead, the parties must redouble their commitment to dialogue, building on the existing frameworks to achieve a durable ceasefire, leading to a lasting solution. In this context, we take note of Russia's offer to hold a second round of direct negotiations in Istanbul and hope that the two sides could make further progress in bringing this protracted conflict to an end. Mr. President, Pakistan's position on the Ukraine conflict has remained clear and consistent. From the outset, we have advocated for an immediate de-escalation to prevent further loss of life, urged all sides to follow meaningful negotiations addressing mutual security concerns within the framework of the UN Charter, supported inclusive and constructive diplomacy involving key regional and international stakeholders to pave the way for a just and lasting peace. In closing, Mr. President, Pakistan reiterates its firm support for a peaceful resolution of this conflict. The alternative, a continued conflict with no end in sight, serves no one's interests. Pakistan stands ready to support all efforts towards a peaceful resolution anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, the relevant multilateral agreements, and which addresses the legitimate national security interests of all sides. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to thank Undersecretary DiCarlo for her briefing and thank Director Doughton for her intervention. Colleagues, more than 3 months have passed since this Council adopted a resolution imploring a swift end to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Following that historic resolution, the United States has worked tirelessly with both sides, seeking a path to peace. We want an end to this war. As the first step on that path to peace, the United States put forward a proposal for an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire. Ukraine unequivocally accepted, pending Russia's agreement to do the same. Since then, we have been urging Russia to accept a ceasefire. Following President Trump's May 21 call with Russian President Putin, the Russian Federation is expected to provide a term sheet broadly outlining its vision for a ceasefire. We will judge Russia's seriousness towards ending the war not only by the contents of that term sheet, but more importantly, by Russia's actions. On that note, we condemn Russia's decision over the past weekend to launch some of the largest missiles and drone strikes against Ukraine since the beginning of the war. This disregard for human life does not demonstrate a desire for peace. It must cease. On the other hand, the recent agreement by both Russia and Ukraine to exchange 1,000 prisoners is an indication of what might be possible. If both Russia and Ukraine are truly interested in peace, the United States will work with both parties, with European partners, and with the United Nations to help achieve that goal, beginning with a meaningful ceasefire. But we will insist the discussion of peace by both sides must be undertaken in good faith. If Russia makes the wrong decision to continue this catastrophic war, the United States will have to consider stepping back from our negotiation efforts to end this conflict. To be clear, in doing so, we would not be abandoning our principles or our friends. Rather, we would be recognizing Russia's refusal to work with us toward a desirable outcome. As President Trump has made clear, we want to work with Russia, including on this peace initiative and an economic package. There is no military solution to this conflict. The deal on offer now is Russia's best possible outcome. President Putin should take the deal. The alternative, continuing to wage the war, would not be in anyone's interest, including Russia's. Doing so would continue to damage Russia's economy, military resources, national security, and international reputation. Additional sanctions on Russia are still on the table. President Trump has emphasized from the beginning that this war was a strategic mistake and should never have happened. Time is not on the side of anyone who would prolong it. We will call on both Russia and Ukraine to make the difficult, historic decision to pursue peace. The responsibility of ending this war ultimately lies with them. If one side proves unable or unwilling to do so, it will own the consequences. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement and now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo and Ms. Lisa Dalton for their valuable briefings. Mr. President, it is regrettable that over the past few days there were signs of de-escalation in Ukraine through the first direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in more than 3 years. And these negotiations were aimed at achieving a ceasefire and finding a peaceful solution to end the war between these two parties. It is regrettable that these recent hostilities once again have driven the situation towards confrontation. Ongoing military operations between the parties still pose a multifaceted threat. They pose a threat to civilians, including women, children, and the elderly, and they pose a threat to infrastructure, including social infrastructures and vital facilities. This undermines any diplomatic effort aimed at ending this protracted war. In this regard, we would reaffirm our full condemnation of attacking and targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure. This is a blatant violation of international law and of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Algeria has always expressed its concern about the military escalation between the parties. That escalation has only led and will continue to lead to the loss of more innocent lives, and it will endanger the safety and security of civilians and will destroy vital institutions such as healthcare, education, and energy facilities, without mentioning the serious repercussions on the food and energy systems. This will continue to impact the entire world, particularly developing countries. Among these developments, Algeria renews its call on both parties to refrain from escalation and military confrontation and to put an end to human suffering and to fully adhere to the provisions of international humanitarian law. That law holds the parties responsible for protecting civilians. Algeria also reiterates its appeal to both sides to prioritize constructive dialogue and consultations and to focus efforts on advancing negotiations and improving opportunities for reaching consensus, while at the same time overcoming and removing obstacles hindering this process. Moreover, Algeria urges all parties to reject polarization, which will only widen the divisions and undermine mediation efforts. They need to adopt approaches aimed at strengthening inclusive and constructive dialogue to prevent a return to escalation and further aggravation between the two parties. In this regard, Algeria welcomes the many ongoing efforts to facilitate dialogue between the two sides and to bring their divergent views closer together. These efforts were recently reflected in the direct meeting between the two parties in Istanbul, Turkey. We also welcome the prisoner exchange agreement reached during the same meeting. This is an important step, and it is a tangible example of the benefits of constructive dialogue and the possibility of fostering mutual understanding and consensus between the two parties. By way of conclusion, Algeria reaffirms its commitment to supporting all international efforts aimed at finding a peaceful, fair, and lasting solution satisfactory to both parties, and that is based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and which takes into account the legitimate security concerns of both sides. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation thanks USG DiCarlo and Director Doughton for their briefings. Mr. President, the current development serve as a reminder of the ongoing volatility in the region and the far-reaching consequences for civilian populations and infrastructure. Recent incidents underscore the urgent need for renewed efforts to reduce tensions and prevent further escalation. We take note of the forthcoming meeting between the representative of Russia and Ukraine planned for next Monday in Istanbul. This initiative represents an important opportunity to advance dialogue and build momentum towards a peaceful settlement. Mr. President, my delegation welcomes all constructive engagement and aimed at fostering mutual understanding and facilitating substantive negotiation. In this context, we call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire by all parties and urge restraint and to prevent any further deterioration of the situation. Lasting peace in Ukraine will only be possible through genuine diplomatic commitment, open channels of communication, and respect for established principles under international law. Constructive engagement remains essential. Only through sustained diplomatic efforts and willingness to compromise can a durable and just peace be achieved. In conclusion, Mr. President, my delegation reiterates its call for comprehensive de-escalation, renewed diplomatic engagement, and pursuit of negotiated lasting peace in Ukraine. We stand ready to support all efforts that move us closer to this shared goal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank USG DiCarlo and Director Doughton for their briefings. Recently, Russia and Ukraine held direct negotiations in Istanbul and reached consensus on the exchange of prisoners. The prisoner swap has now been completed smoothly, and Russia and Ukraine will soon hold a second round of direct negotiations. China welcomes these positive developments and supports all efforts towards achieving peace. At the same time, the two parties to this conflict are still engaged in large-scale drone and missile attacks. The fighting shows no sign of stopping, and the number of civilian casualties continues to rise. This pains our hearts and is deeply worrying. It fully shows that the Ukraine crisis involves complex dynamics and problems and cannot be resolved overnight. Here I wish to make 3 points. First, parties concerned to the conflict should demonstrate political will, maintain the momentum of peace talks, address the root causes of the crisis through dialogue and consultation, and reach a fair, lasting, and binding peace agreement acceptable to all parties concerned, so as to ultimately realize a political settlement. Second, parties to the conflict should real earnest abide by international humanitarian law and refrain from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure under all circumstances. Both sides should make concerted efforts and take active measures to cool down the situation on the battlefield. Third, the international community, especially important stakeholders, should increase their reasonable cause for a ceasefire to end the fighting and for promoting peace talks, and should create a positive atmosphere and enabling conditions and provide necessary assistance to facilitate a political solution to the crisis. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. Since the start of the crisis, we have been calling for a dialogue, negotiation, and a political settlement. And we remain fundamentally guided by the 4 principles put forward by President Xi Jinping. Our position is that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be abided by, that the reasonable security concerns of all parties should be taken seriously, and that all efforts for peace should be supported. China has stayed in contact with both Russia and Ukraine and has been working consistently to promote peace talks. China, together with Brazil and other countries of the Global South, initiated the Friends of Peace Group on Ukraine crisis, which aims at building international consensus and promoting peace efforts to facilitate a political solution to the crisis. On the 13th of May, China and Brazil issued a joint statement on the Ukraine crisis, supporting direct dialogue between Russia and Ukraine, and stating the expectation of the start of fruitful negotiations between the parties concerned to build greater consensus and realize a political settlement. Together with the Global South and the international community, China will continue playing a constructive role for achieving real peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Panama.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Panama considera
Panama believes
el llamado a esta reunión
that it was interesting to call for this meeting given the critical turn of events in the conflict in Ukraine. We are grateful to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, USG for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and Ms. Lisa Doughton, Director of Financing and Partnership Division, OCHA, for their briefings and their valuable contributions. We acknowledge the presence of representatives from the delegation of Ukraine, Czechia, Estonia, Poland, and Iceland, and the European Union.
Panama
reiterates its alarm at the protracted war in Ukraine, which continues to lead to the loss of human life, countless injured and displaced. As we have said on this and on other occasions regarding conflicts, relentless attacks against the civilian population, in those circumstances, we urgently call for compliance with IHL. We therefore condemn recent attacks which, according to available reports, Russian forces carried out with missiles and drones for 3 consecutive nights on the 24th, 25th, and 26th of May in Kyiv and other regions against civilian population and infrastructure. According to a communiqué by the High Commissioner Volker Turk, these attacks caused the death of 14 civilians, including 3 children, and injured some 88 people, of which 11 were children. A generation of children have been traumatized by the sound of air raid sirens and by the loss of their loved ones. This is a collective failure for humanity. Similarly, over the past weekend, a large number of long-range drones were launched against the Russian Federation by Ukrainian armed forces, injuring at least 11 civilians, according to Russian authorities. Panama reiterates its call for an immediate cessation of hostilities in unconditional respect for life, security, and dignity of the civilian population, and in respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Resistance to a ceasefire is causing suffering for the civilian population, who is being held hostage by sustained attacks, and this has led to an increase of IDPs. According to figures from the United Nations Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, by the beginning of 2025, there were more than 3.6 million IDPs. Political and diplomatic efforts have led to the start of efforts aimed at talks towards a peace process. It is therefore essential to continue with diplomatic efforts and to create a climate of trust and ongoing dialogue, and to abstain from any actions which will perpetuate the conflict and jeopardize the opportunities for political settlement. Similarly, the ability to negotiate in order to find points of convergence demonstrated in the recent repatriation of prisoners of war is a practice which must continue, always in accordance with the principles of IHL. Mr. President, the repercussions of this conflict are felt as well on the global economy and supply chains, exacerbating the many crises we as developing countries face. And therefore, the international community needs to support any initiative leading to a peaceful solution. Panama encourages the parties to choose diplomacy as the only possible way to understanding and a commitment to just and lasting peace in Ukraine, pursuant to the provisions of the UN Charter and international law. Thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Panama for his statement, and now give the floor to the Representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank USG DiCarlo and Director Dalton for their briefings. We welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, as the conflict in Ukraine moves beyond day 1,190, it is essential that the Security Council remains actively engaged in efforts to forge a path towards peace and bring an end to the conflict, which continues to claim innocent lives and cause widespread devastation. In recent days, attacks on densely populated areas across Ukraine have resulted in at least 13 civilian deaths and 65 injuries, including women and children. Several regions in Ukraine remain particularly affected, with the period of 24 to 28 May reported to be the most intense assault since 2022. Drone attacks targeting areas in Russia, including Moscow, and also signal an alarming escalation. The indiscriminate use of long-range missiles and drones on both sides underscores a troubling development, not in line with the principles of international humanitarian law and the imperative to protect civilian lives. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned by the continuing escalation of retaliatory attacks, even as diplomatic efforts are underway to secure a ceasefire. After more than 3 years of active conflict, it is increasingly clear that a military solution is unattainable. Only a negotiated ceasefire and a comprehensive peace agreement, one that takes into account the legitimate concerns of all parties, will offer a pathway to sustainable peace. The humanitarian consequences of the conflict have been devastating. Since February 2022, a conservative estimate puts the number of casualties at approximately 45,001, including over 13,134 killed. Children remain disproportionately affected, with more than 220 killed or injured between January and April 2025, and many subjected to mental and psychological trauma due to the persistent threat of violence and disruption of essential services, including education. We reiterate our call for the return of Ukrainian children who have been forcibly removed or separated from their families. We also note the recent statement by UN Women on the disproportionate impact of the conflict on women's lives and livelihoods, and we emphasize the need for women's full and meaningful participation in peace negotiations and recovery processes on both sides. Mr. President, approximately 12.7 million people in Ukraine require life-saving humanitarian assistance this year. We commend the bravery and dedication of humanitarian workers who continue their efforts despite ongoing risks. Sierra Leone deplores the killing of 2 humanitarian workers and the injury of 16 others during the months of March and April. The protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel, must remain an essential obligation in accordance with international humanitarian law and the fundamental principles of human dignity. The widespread destruction of critical infrastructure, including healthcare, education, water, energy, and gas facilities, has deepened an already dire humanitarian crisis. The World Bank has estimated this year's damages at approximately $176 billion, with long-term reconstruction and recovery projected at around $525 billion over the next decade. In this regard, we join the call for sustained and increased support to the Ukraine Humanitarian Response Plan and the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, noting with concern that recent funding shortfalls have led to the suspension of scaling back of essential humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, in light of the enduring and far-reaching consequences of this conflict, Sierra Leone urges all parties to recommit to meaningful ceasefire and peace negotiations. We acknowledge the efforts of the United States, European leaders, and regional actors who continue to facilitate dialogue aimed at the escalation. We also take note of the positive developments, including the recent exchange of approximately 1,000 prisoners of war and civilian detainees from both sides as a significant confidence-building measure. At this critical juncture, we call on both sides to prioritize peace and the well-being of their populations and engage in direct, high-level dialogue. We further urge the escalation of military activities, including the mobilization of troops along border regions. In conclusion, this Council must remain engaged in supporting the parties towards a comprehensive ceasefire and a stable peace, including in areas such as Black Sea, which is vital to global commerce. Our efforts must remain guided by the principles of the United Nations Charter and international law. Sierra Leone reiterates its call for full adherence to international law, particularly international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, the facilitation of unhindered humanitarian access, and renewed diplomatic engagement aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG DiCarlo and OCHA Director Lisa Doughton for their updates, and welcome the participation of the representatives of Ukraine, Czechia, Estonia, Poland, Iceland, and the European Union in today's meeting. Mr. President, like clockwork, this Council knows that every month we will meet to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Some months, as many as 4 times. In similar terms, we have grown accustomed to expecting that the meetings will conclude, having not reached or gotten any closer to a solution. Yet each time we meet, we are briefed about the worsening situation as lives and livelihoods continue to be shattered. It is time that this cycle is broken and progress is made towards ending this war. The briefings highlight in very stark terms the dire humanitarian situation in Ukraine, a situation that has tragically worsened in recent weeks with drone and missile strikes. The recent aerial strikes over the weekend are reportedly the largest seen so far in the war and have claimed the lives of several civilians, including children. It came at a time when considerable efforts are being made to achieve a ceasefire. We are deeply disappointed that there have been setbacks along the road to a lasting ceasefire, and welcome the recent announcement of a follow-up meeting between the two parties. We took positive note of the first meeting between Russian and Ukrainian officials in Istanbul on May 16, which resulted in the exchange of 1,000 prisoners on each side. We welcome such efforts, which we hope will ultimately lead to a ceasefire and a much-needed respite for the Russian and Ukrainian people. Mr. President, on the humanitarian situation, Guyana deplores the continued killing and maiming of civilians and calls for an immediate end to the indiscriminate attacks. International humanitarian law is clear. Conflict parties must take all feasible precautions to minimize civilian harm. Guyana continues to stress that the consequences of such violations of international law are not confined to borders and cannot be left unchecked. OHCHR has repeatedly sounded the alarm about widespread and systematic attacks being carried out in Ukraine. We are now hearing about the use of drones with embedded cameras that are focused on visibly civilian targets. Guyana calls for an end to this senseless violence and for full accountability for violations of international humanitarian law. We also reiterate that central to achieving a permanent ceasefire in the current context is the need to reach an agreement on the immediate cessation of hostilities, unimpeded humanitarian access, including to the temporarily occupied territories, and the provision of necessary security guarantees inter alia. At this critical juncture, we urge the parties to remain focused and to avoid any missteps that could doom millions of Ukrainian Russian citizens to even more bombardment and displacement. We remain supportive of all efforts aimed at bringing the parties together to achieving a lasting and sustainable ceasefire. We also urge this Council to engage constructively toward that end. 3 years on, it should be clear to all that there is no military solution and no winners in this war. Finally, we must all uphold our responsibility and, as custodians of peace and defenders of the UN Charter, work together to ensure the protection of civilians wherever they are. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for her statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we'd like to once again state for the record that we completely disagree with the Presidency's approach that is inviting delegations to today's meetings under Rules 37 and 39. Aside from Ukraine, there are 5 more delegations who've been invited. They're either NATO members or EU members or their allies. Every time these delegations spend at least half an hour of our precious time given the budget deficit at the UN, the very valuable time of the Security Council, so as to read out the same narratives with their zero added value, in addition to the representative of the EU. This situation is unacceptable, and responsibility for this falls squarely on the shoulders of the Presidency. Without a doubt, the European nations, when they hold the presidencies of the Security Council, are simply impossible to place the impartiality of the Security Council above bloc solidarity. This undermines our credibility and the value of our discussions. However, we are counting on European delegations, especially the main sponsors pumping the Kiev regime full of weapons. We hope they will also ask to speak tomorrow at the briefing we requested on the theme of European attempts to thwart the peace process surrounding Ukraine. We have a lot of questions, and we will be expecting answers. We aren't expecting answers, but we do harbor the hope that the EU will answer at least some of them, not as part of a staged EU-NATO event organized by them for their purposes, based on preparations made by Brussels. But, as called for here at the Security Council, as part of an interactive discussion as the entire international community looks on. Strategic sovereignty was lost long ago by our former European partners, and they are incapable of doing what I just asked for. President, the script of today's meeting is absolutely clear and predictable. This meeting, much like previous similar initiatives undertaken by our Western and of late European colleagues specifically, these meetings are convened not to resolve problems nor to bring the Ukrainian crisis closer to a peaceful settlement. The goal is to stop an image of a supposedly free and democratic Ukraine from being definitively deflated. Ukraine, which has the image of a victim of a so-called Russian aggression, an image which the European sponsors of the regime in Kiev are trying to keep afloat. They've been doing this for years now. They began creating this image long before Russia launched its special military operation in Ukraine. It's becoming increasingly difficult for London, Paris, Berlin, and their satellites to blow up this propaganda bubble, because the dictatorship in Kiev and the endeavors of the Kiev overstay princeling to cling to power at any costs, power he would lose if peace were to prevail, are patently obvious. The biggest fear of Zelensky are the elections when he and his sidekicks will have to answer for not keeping their promises about peace with Russia, not protecting the rights of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, respect for rights and freedoms in a country which he himself has turned into a concentration camp and a meat grinder. Moreover, as long as the bugbear of a Russian threat exists, the Zelensky policy doesn't have to account for all of the money stolen from state coffers, nor the stealing of Western and, in particular, U.S. assistance, which amounts to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars. This isn't something Zelensky's European accomplices and the Biden administration want, those who have profited handsomely from the Ukrainian conflict. That's why the main objective of this group of militarists is to prevent the main shareholder, the U.S., from exiting the Ukraine anti-Russia geopolitical project. They want to prolong the war for as long as possible. This isn't easy because the new U.S. administration has, over the last few months, opened its eyes and seen the true colors of the Zelensky regime as well as the root causes of the Ukrainian conflict. That's why they're resorting to any and every provocation, any and all lies about Russia, its activities and plans. Today, once again, in this chamber, they're asking us to believe that Russia is knowingly shelling residential areas of Ukrainian cities, serving up as evidence the consequences of Ukrainian air defenses, which have been stationed next to homes and social infrastructure in violation of basic norms of international humanitarian law. At the same time, what's being hushed up is the fact that our strikes target exclusively facilities linked to Ukraine's military-industrial complex, and we are successfully destroying or rendering these facilities inoperable. Over the last few days, we've hit munitions storages and military technologies in the Dnepropetrovsk region, a temporary deployment site, and rocket and artillery munitions warehouses of the Ukrainian Armed Forces Mechanized Brigade in the Sumy area, as well as a temporary deployment site for foreign mercenaries in Svetogorsk, in the DPR, and in the Kharkov regions. A strike was conducted on a defense industry plant in Ukraine. That's the Pavlogradsky chemicals plant in the Dnepropetrovsk region. We destroyed 2 Patriot anti-aircraft missile system launchers. Rockets were fired on an unloading and storage area containing military equipment and munitions in Odessa port. This resulted in the destruction of roughly 100 containers containing important components for uncrewed vessels, UAVs, as well as munitions. What is also being hushed up is the fact that the Russian Federation is doing what I just mentioned only in response to massive and deliberate shelling on the part of the Kiev regime of peaceable Russian cities. Thus, despite the fact that the Russian Federation called a 72-hour ceasefire to mark the 80th anniversary of the victory over fascism, between the 8th and the 11th of May, we recorded over 14,000 violations, over 4,000 attacks by artillery, tanks and mortars, 62 attacks using MLRSs, 9,900 strikes and releases of munitions from UAVs. We recorded 5 attempts to break through Russia's state border in the Belgorodskaya and Kursk regions, as well as 37 attacks waged by the Ukrainian armed forces. In those 3 days, an aggression was waged by Bandera's followers, which claimed the lives of 6 Russian civilians and at least 17 people were injured. It's very telling that the most massive attacks by UAVs on civilian objects in Russian cities, including Russia, far removed from the front line, were waged by Kiev after we saw nascent progress towards peace. Specifically, they waged these attacks after direct Russo-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul were resumed and set a course towards an end to the conflict. Between 8 p.m. on the 20th of May and 8 a.m. on the 27th of May, what was destroyed and intercepted is 2,331 UAVs launched from Ukraine, including 1,465 which were outside the area where we're conducting this special military operation. Regrettably, as a result, there were civilian casualties, including women and children. On the 22nd of May, due to an attack on the village of Pantelimonovka in the Donetsk People's Republic, 8 people were wounded. On that very same day, in the Vasilyevsk municipality in the Zaporizhia region, owing to a UAV strike, a woman died. She was born in 1990. 4 children were wounded. The Ukrainian armed forces also struck civilian objects in the city of Lvov in the Kursk Oblast using HIMARS, and 16 people were wounded, including 2 children. President, the plans concocted by Zelensky and his accomplices are plain and clear. Their goal is to trick and to disorient President Trump, who is taking decisive steps towards peace. At any cost, they want to return the United States, which has lost hundreds of billions of dollars helping Ukraine, to return the U.S. to an anti-Russian and Russophobic course. We will discuss their methods and tactics in detail tomorrow, which are aimed at undermining the efforts of Russian, U.S. and other regional mediators' efforts. We'll do this tomorrow, as we requested a meeting on the specific topic. We won't do that now. What I will say now is that promoting Ukrainian and Western lies about Russia is becoming increasingly difficult because the actual actions of the Kiev regime, its deliberate choice, that is war, and the further suffering of their citizens speak volumes. What's also absolutely clear are the peace initiatives and concrete steps being taken by the Russian leadership. We intend to continue pursuing this course, as well as to continue a serious, direct negotiations process with Ukraine, which Ukraine itself suspended in April 2022, egged on by the British Premier Boris Johnson and like-minded Russophobes. The outcome of this process should be a decision, or rather a solution, which would reliably address the root causes of the Ukrainian conflict and the threats to the security of my country emanating from Ukraine. Ukraine has been invited to meet in Istanbul on the 2nd of June and to discuss the content of our memoranda regarding approaches to the negotiations process. While Kiev continues attempting to prolong the war and to provoke Russia striking at residential and civilian infrastructure on our territory, while they do that, we will continue our special military operation and we will continue destroying objects linked to Kiev's military capabilities. No new anti-Russian sanctions, nor deliveries of weapons to Ukraine or any other hostile steps vis-à-vis Russia will be able to prevent the inevitable military defeat of the Zelensky regime. The ball is in Ukraine's court. Either talks followed by peace, or the unavoidable defeat of Ukraine on the battlefield with different conditions for the conflict's end. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Greece. I would like to thank Undersecretary Di Carlo and OCHA Director Doughton for the detailed briefings. Colleagues, it has already been a month since the Council was last seized of the war in Ukraine. One would hope that in the meantime, peace talks under the US-led initiative would have borne tangible results. After all, the United States and Ukraine agreed to a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire almost 3 months ago, and all parties to the war, including Russia, have declared their intention to achieve a peaceful settlement. Yes, this ceasefire still eludes us on Russian responsibility. Instead of building on the promise of peace, there has been a continuation of deadly attacks in May, while noting that April, according to verified data of the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, becomes a deadly month not only for Ukrainian civilians in general since September 2024, but particularly for children since June 2022. As the UN Humanitarian Coordinator has stressed, across Ukraine, no place is safe. We echo the Secretary General's condemnation of the latest attack and join our voice with the overwhelming majority of the UN membership, which in multiple General Assembly resolutions have demanded the cessation of hostilities and the return to peace in full respect of international law and the UN Charter. Greece condemns any targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure as a clear violation of the basic tenets of international humanitarian law and demands accountability for the perpetrators and justice for the victims. In this regard, we commend the role of UN agencies such as UNICEF for the multifaceted support to civilians and in particular to children, as well as the tireless efforts and courage of humanitarian workers who have also suffered increased casualties these last months. Colleagues, regrettably, peace efforts, culminating in the attempts at direct bilateral negotiation on May 16, did not produce any breakthrough. On the contrary, they have so far further confirmed Russia's intransigence. At the same time, The agreement for the largest exchange of prisoners of war and civilian detainees between the two sides since the start of the war is a welcome development and the only tangible deliverable of the negotiation. In closing, let me reiterate that Greece's stance through this 39th month of war has been principled and consistent in favor of international law, including international humanitarian law and the principle of the UN Charter. In that respect, we reiterate that a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire should remain our first priority on the way to our ultimate goal of achieving, firstly, a permanent cessation of hostility, secondly, a just, comprehensive and lasting peace achieved through inclusive diplomacy in line with the UN Charter and international law that upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity, and thirdly, security guarantees that will prevent the recurrence of war. I thank you. I resume now my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I express gratitude to the Greek presidency for convening today's Security Council meeting, and thank USG DiCarlo and OCHA's representative, Ms. Doughton, for substantive briefings. Today is already the 1,191st day of Ukraine's resistance against the Russian Federation's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified full-scale military invasion. Russia's aim remains unchanged: to subjugate Ukraine militarily, seeking control over our entire nation to further its imperialistic ambitions. Failing to achieve these objectives independently, it enlists support from authoritarian regimes such as the DPRK and Iran. Moreover, Ukrainian intelligence has confirmed that China is supplying special chemicals, gunpowder, and machinery to 20 Russian military factories, and this cooperation must cease immediately. Ukraine continues to defend itself in full accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter. We are grateful for the unwavering support of the European and American and other partners and allies, which bolsters our defense capabilities. Simply put, Ukraine did not initiate this war, nor do we desire its continuation today. On its part, Russia could end its aggression at any moment, but persistently rejects all credible paths to peace. Mr. President, Ukraine has consistently demonstrated commitment to diplomacy and remains open to any format that can yield tangible results. We supported the U.S. proposal for a 30-day full interim unconditional ceasefire agreed upon in Jeddah on 11 March. Ukraine firmly believes that at least 30 days long ceasefire must be the first step towards negotiations on just and lasting peace. We reaffirmed this proposal multiple times, but Russia consistently refuses to accept it. Russia's actions clearly indicate its unwillingness for peace. On 20 April, despite media reports of Russia's alleged readiness for so-called Easter ceasefire, Russian forces carried out 1,882 shelling attacks, conducted 33 multiple launch rocket system strikes, and deployed 957 kamikaze drones against Ukraine. Russia again declared solely through media channels its readiness for a ceasefire since 8 till 10 May. In practice, it launched 115 airstrikes, dropped 197 guided aerial bombs, carried out 12,100 shelling attacks, including 187 by multiple launch rocket systems, and targeted civilian infrastructure with 7,303 kamikaze drones. This is what Russia's so-called ceasefire entailed. On 10 May, Ukraine, alongside European leaders from France, Germany, Poland, and the United Kingdom, supported by the US and other partners, called Russia again to agree to a 30-day ceasefire. The collective will of Ukraine and its partners was clear. If the Russian Federation refused, robust sanctions would be imposed on Russia, particularly targeting the energy and banking sectors. Russia's response was to reject an unconditional ceasefire and instead demand direct negotiations with Ukraine in Turkey. We are not afraid of talks. We are for constructive talks. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, was ready for a personal meeting with Putin because only Putin decides the strategic issues of war and peace in Russia. Our president visited Turkey on 15 May, ready for a direct meeting, whether in Ankara or Istanbul. Putin, however, refused to attend, sending a low-level delegation lacking decision-making authority. Despite this, a high-level Ukrainian negotiating team headed by Defense Minister Rustem Umerov was ready to discuss the ceasefire. Notably, Russian delegation mostly consisted of the same individuals it had sent to Istanbul in 2022. This demonstrates that Russia has not altered its fundamental approach. Their goal is to transform the Istanbul meeting into a staged, hollow process reminiscent of the talks in 2022. It is not Ukraine or Western leaders who are undermining negotiations, as Russia claims. It is Russia that sends delegation with no decision-making mandate, effectively nullifying the prospects of diplomacy. The only positive result of the meeting in Istanbul is an agreed exchange of prisoners of war in the format 1,000 for 1,000, implemented on 23rd, 25th May. Overall, if one sets aside all Russian nonsense, pseudo-historical statements, provocations, and the like, the Russian plan to present the Istanbul meeting as a continuation of March 2022 has failed. This is a completely new dynamic. The conditions and realities are different now. In order to overcome the current diplomatic stalemate, there is a need for a meeting at the leaders' level, and President Zelensky has repeatedly reaffirmed his readiness to meet with Putin at any time and at any mutually agreeable location. We will continue to insist on an unconditional and complete ceasefire for at least 30 days as the only viable foundation for the success of any further discussions and steps. However, Russia is now trying to buy time in order to continue its war and occupy more Ukrainian land. It continues to intimidate and terrorize Ukrainian civilians by attacking the critical infrastructure and residential areas. All of this sends a clear signal. Russia does not desire to end this war and is neither willing nor ready for genuine negotiations. Russia's actions warrant full-scale pressure to limit its military capabilities and to push it toward real peace. The Istanbul meeting and its follow-up cannot and will not serve as an excuse not to increase pressure on Russia. On the contrary, it is proof of why such pressure is urgently needed. The strength of this pressure is inversely proportional to the Russians' willingness to be constructive and embark on a genuine peace process. Mr. President, the Russian Federation continues to escalate its brutal and systematic attacks on civilians across Ukraine. Day and night, Ukraine endures relentless waves of deadly drone and missile strikes. In May, their scale and intensity have reached unprecedented levels of devastation. On 24th and 25th May, the Russian Federation executed one of the largest combined assaults since the onset of its full-scale aggression, launching 83 missiles of various types and 548 drones against civilian targets across Ukraine. The attacks killed at least 12 civilians and injured dozens of others. In the Zhytomyr region, an airstrike on a residential neighborhood killed 3 siblings from one family: 8-year-old Stanislav, 12-year-old Tamara, and 17-year-old Roman. On 26 May, Russia launched its largest drone attack since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, using 355 attack drones, along with 9 cruise missiles targeting civilian areas, again killing and injuring civilians and damaging or destroying residential buildings and civilian infrastructure. In just these 3 days, Russia launched over 900 attack drones, along with ballistic and cruise missiles. Russian terror against civilians continues every single day. Today, Russia launched an airstrike on the village in the Zaporizhzhia region using guided bombs. The attack killed at least 2 civilians and injured 3 others. More than 50 homes are damaged and 5 were destroyed, and nearly 600 households lost electricity. These strikes lack military logic, and the aggressor state is gaining nothing. They are clearly intended to terrorize the civilian population, inflict widespread destruction, and reflect a blatant disregard for international humanitarian law and a profound contempt for diplomacy. They also represent a deliberate political decision, Putin's decision to continue his war of aggression. Each such terrorist attack justifies the imposition of new strengthening sanctions against the Russian Federation. The silence of the international community only emboldens Putin. These ongoing attacks underscore the urgent need for continuing expanded support to protect Ukrainian civilians from indiscriminate violence. We are deeply grateful to every partner and ally assisting Ukraine in strengthening our air defense capabilities. The timely delivery of air defense systems saves lives. Ukraine welcomes the recent report by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, which for the first time documents Russia's systematic drone attacks against civilians in the Kherson region. This inhuman tactic of terror has continued for a long time and must not go unpunished. Threats to Ukraine's civilian population represent a new and troubling aspect of modern warfare, potentially setting a precedent for future full-scale conflicts. A defining feature is the constant, direct threat of missile and long-range drone attacks across the entire country, even in regions over 1,000 kilometers from the front line. This sustained threat not only endangers civilian lives, but also severely impacts the psychological, security, and socio-economic well-being of the population. It is an integral element of Russia's military strategy that must be duly addressed within the UN broader efforts and discussions on the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Mr. President, let's remind that thousands of Ukrainians, both civilians and military personnel, remain imprisoned in the Russian Federation or in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Many were captured before 2022. They continue to be subjected to torture, inhuman and degrading treatment, and conflict-related sexual violence, in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Russia continues to return Ukrainians in a highly selective and arbitrary manner. Ukraine demands immediate and unconditional stop of all torture and ill treatment of detainees and full adherence to the Geneva Conventions on the treatment of prisoners, as well as compliance with the UN standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the Nelson Mandela rules, and the Bangkok rules, which set gender-specific standards for the treatment of women in detention. Mr. President, the situation at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remains critically difficult, where all the 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety and security during an armed conflict continue to be systematically violated. Moscow blatantly disregards international diplomatic efforts, including by the United States, aimed at ending Russia's war of aggression and ensuring global nuclear safety. According to Greenpeace, Russia is building a new high-voltage power line in the temporarily occupied territory of Zaporizhzhia region to illegally connect the NPP to the Russian power grid. Let me stress that disconnecting the NPP from Ukraine's power grid significantly increases the risks. In the event of an emergency, the plant could lose its last reliable source of external power. This is a direct path to a station blackout with potentially catastrophic consequences. Furthermore, Moscow's policy of blackmail and demonstrative disregard for international law forced the IAEA to conduct a second rotation through the temporarily occupied territory of Ukraine. We insist that despite Russian pressure, the IAEA remains committed to the principles of international law, in particularly the inviolability of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and does not recognize any changes in jurisdiction over the NPP. Ukraine urges the IAEA and international community to respond to these actions by the Russian Federation decisively. The rotation of IAEA personnel should be carried out exclusively through the territory controlled by the government of Ukraine until the NPP is fully returned to its rightful owner, Ukraine. Mr. President, achieving peace at any cost will not end the war. A comprehensive, just, and lasting peace must rest on a fundamental respect towards non-negotiable principles. We repeat, Ukraine will never accept and recognize any part of its temporarily occupied territory as Russian. We will not tolerate interference in sovereign decisions, including our defense or alliances. There must be no appeasement of the aggressor. Such attempts only embolden future aggression. Russia is not signaling any genuine intention to stop its war. Therefore, we see no alternative but intensified international pressure, political, military, and economic. Sanctions must be expanded and strengthened. Russian oil, its shadow tanker fleet, financial networks, and its military industry must all be targeted. Russia is facing a moment when it needs to prove its seriousness. We need concrete decisions, first and foremost, regarding an unconditional and complete ceasefire for at least 30 days. Ukraine is ready to work for peace. Russia must also show that it is ready. As a confidence-building measure, we propose the immediate and unconditional return of all abducted Ukrainian children, prisoners of war, and detained civilians. For peace to endure, justice must prevail. We welcome progress by the core group on establishing a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. Technical work on the necessary legal instruments is complete. Mr. President, at the heart of global peace and security lies the Charter of the United Nations. Upholding it is not optional, it is our collective duty. That is the standard by which each member of this Council, and indeed the international community, will be judged. Yet today we witness a grave distortion of that duty. The Russian Federation, still present in the Soviet permanent seat, is using its status not to preserve peace, but to shield its war of aggression against Ukraine. This abuse strikes at the core of the international system we are all meant to uphold. Ukraine, for its part, seeks a just and lasting peace, one rooted in the principles of the UN Charter and reinforced by binding long-term security guarantees. Peace cannot rest on words alone, and particularly because words do not work with Moscow. It requires concrete steps, an immediate and just ceasefire, sustained diplomatic engagement, and the establishment of a credible security architecture centered around effective security guarantees for Ukraine that will prevent the recurrence of aggression. This is why Ukraine is working with all partners, the United States, the European Union, and all international partners, to build a broad-based, principled coalition for peace. But to succeed, the international community must act with unity and resolve. Now is not the time for hesitation. Now is the time to increase coordinated pressure, not merely to influence the course of Russia's war of aggression, but to bring it to a close and to secure peace for all our future generations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for her statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Czechia.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking the Greek presidency of the Security Council for convening this important meeting. We stand at a critical juncture, a moment that demands we decide whether the senseless killing and suffering of civilians in Ukraine shall continue, or whether we shall finally see an end to Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion, now in its 12th year. The choice before Russia is stark and simple. No amount of diplomatic sophistry or propaganda can obscure this fundamental question. Is Putin's Russia prepared to end the death and suffering it has inflicted upon Ukraine? Ukraine has demonstrated its commitment to peace through actions, not merely words. President Zelensky has repeatedly stated Ukraine's readiness for an immediate, unconditional 30-day ceasefire and the commencement of talks to end this war permanently. No strings attached, no preconditions. Meanwhile, Russia continues to play for time. When Russia's president suggested direct talks, Ukraine's president accepted without hesitation, ready to meet his counterpart face to face. Yet, while Ukraine stretches out its hand, the Kremlin bides its time. I invite you to draw your own conclusions about who genuinely seeks peace and who perpetuates killing and suffering. The past several days have reminded us yet again of Russia's true intentions. We have witnessed the relentless escalation of aerial attacks against Ukrainian cities that kill innocent civilians, including children, and devastate civilian infrastructure with calculated cruelty. The time has come to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Czechia joins others in calling upon this Council and the wider international community to help create the conditions for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, a peace that upholds the UN Charter and all relevant General Assembly resolutions. Ladies and gentlemen, peace cannot be dictated by the aggressor. Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and right to choose its own future must be guaranteed. Mr. President, the path forward is clear. The choice is Russia's to make. The world is watching. End the invasion, respect international law, silence the guns, sit down at the table in good faith, end this now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Czechia for his statement, And now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Estonia.
President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We align ourselves with a statement by the European Union. I would like to thank briefers for their valuable input. President, there hasn't been a day since the beginning of the Russian aggression when Russia has not bombed Ukraine. Even this last weekend, while Russia claims that it is actively pursuing peace, it conducted the most intense wave of aerial attacks against Ukraine since the beginning of the aggression, using roughly 1,000 drones and missiles to deliberately attack civilians and civilian infrastructure. This terror should be condemned by all who claim to stand for peace and justice. President, since Russia's aggression, Ukraine has repeatedly expressed its unwavering commitment and political will to reach a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. Ukraine agreed to a full and unconditional ceasefire proposed by the United States. President Zelensky expressed readiness to meet with Putin to discuss peace, but Russian side ignored this opportunity, sending a sham delegation to the meeting instead. We see Kremlin dragging its feet and using all sorts of fabricated excuses, while raising already unreasonable demands even further, making it clear that Moscow has no interest in agreeing to a real ceasefire in Ukraine. How long do we have to endure this drawn-out routine, all the while Russia keeps on implementing its genocidal policy? For how long? These attacks are not madness, but a deliberate attempt by Russia to eradicate any hope Ukrainians have. Russia is adopting the tactics of the Nazis, who systematically carpet-bombed London in 1940 and 1941, with sole aim of making the British population feel terrified, hopeless, and force its leaders to surrender. The Nazis failed, and so will Russia. President, Kremlin is trying to convince all of us, the United States in particular, that our support to Ukraine is futile. Russia is calculating that by demonstrating its ability to harm and bleed Ukraine, it can also paralyze our political will to support Kiev. However, Russia's assessment seems to be as adequate as was the original expectation to overrun Ukraine in 3 days. However, Russia's aggression and imperial zeal can only be curbed by increased joint international pressure. Pressure to force Russia into peace in Ukraine and cease Russian aggression once and for all. Persuasion and appeasement are perceived as a weakness in Moscow and therefore embolden the aggressor. Only increasing support to the victim of aggression, Ukraine, and raising the cost of aggression for Russia can pave a way to a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Full accountability is an integral part of any just peace. By establishing the Special Tribunal on Russia's crime of aggression against Ukraine, under the auspices of the Council of Europe, we bring to justice those individuals who have committed heinous crimes. President, we welcome the talks in Istanbul between Ukraine and Russia on 16th of May, and the subsequent exchange of prisoners of war. We call on Russia to immediately proceed with an all-for-all prisoners swap, as Ukraine proposed a long time ago. The testimonies of the returned Ukrainian prisoners of war are consistent with the UN reporting on the widespread abuse and torture conducted in revived Russian Gulag prison network. We therefore urge Russia to respect international law and the Geneva Conventions, stop torture, starvation, and ill treatment of prisoners of war, and ensure their access to adequate medical assistance. Finally, President, we continue to stand by Ukraine and reiterate our collective effort aimed at reaching a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN General Assembly resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Estonia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Poland.
Mr. President, Excellencies, at the outset, let me thank the Greek Presidency for convening this important meeting and for accepting our request to participate in it. I'd also would like to thank the distinguished briefers for their insights. Mr. President, we meet on the 1,191st day of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. From the very first day, Poland, along with the other UN members, has been appealing for putting an end to the Russian war against Ukraine. All we wish for is a just and lasting peace at our borders. There have been 1,191 opportunities to end this aggression by introducing an immediate, full and unconditional ceasefire that could open the way to genuine peace negotiations based on the full realization of international law. Unfortunately, for 1,191 days, President Putin has been deaf to the demands of the world. He pretends to be open to negotiations, while in reality, he simply plays for time in order to attain stronger position on the battlefield, no matter how many human lives it will cost. Russia has constantly and bluntly rebuffed any attempts to find a way to initiate a real peace talks offered by the different entities. Mr. President, best illustrations of Russia's lack of commitment to de-escalation was provided by the largest drones attack against Ukrainian cities since the beginning of the war, in parallel to the last weekend's Russian-Ukrainian exchange of 1,000 prisoners of war. The latter we welcome as a positive development. We condemn the latest Russian missile attacks on cities in Ukraine. Right after this body, the Security Council finished debating on the absolute necessity to protect the civilians in the times of armed conflicts. Many innocent Ukrainians died or were wounded, including defenseless children. As per recent reports, April 2025 has been deadliest month for children in Ukraine since June 2022. At least 19 children were killed and 78 injured. We continue to call for holding Russia fully accountable for violation of international law, human rights, war crimes and crime of aggression at both state and individual levels. Mr. President, Poland actively supports US-led diplomatic efforts towards peace. To be sustainable, peace must be just, comprehensive and based on the UN Charter and its provision of sovereignty, territorial integrity and the equality of states. And it must be accompanied by the security guarantees not for Russia, but for the future without Russian attacks, not only against Ukraine, but also against other European countries. In conclusion, Mr. President, Poland will remain determined to continue a multifaceted support for Ukraine, including through financial, economic, humanitarian, and military and diplomatic means, for as long as it takes to help Ukraine exercise its inherent right to self-defense. Such resolve, in the face of the unprovoked and illegal invasion, remains the joint obligation of the international community. And I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Poland for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Iceland.
President, thank you for giving me the floor. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Iceland. Let me thank the briefers today for their substantive and solemn briefings. The Nordics have been stalwart supporters of the UN since its foundation. We are and always will be friends of the UN Charter, and we will continue to stand by it. Our common security depends on it. The General Assembly has repeatedly condemned Russia's blatant violations of international law, including the UN Charter. Russia will be held to account. No one wants an end to this war more than Ukrainians. We have joined Ukraine and international partners, including the US, in calling for a full, unconditional ceasefire, to which Ukraine has already committed more than 2 months ago. A ceasefire would end the suffering and allow for meaningful talks. It is now for Russia to reciprocate. Instead, Russia prevaricates. Instead, Russia continues to launch waves of attack on Ukrainian cities, which in the last 5 days have caused at least 160 casualties. Yet again, innocent children are paying the price for Russia's brutal war. The humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine has said that no place is safe. This is on top of many months of targeted attacks on civilian infrastructure, residential neighborhoods, and energy facilities. All this at enormous cost in lives and destruction of property, and with total disregard for Russia's obligations under international humanitarian law. Russia could end this war tomorrow. Instead, it continues to pursue maximalist aims. Russia has consistently claimed that there are so-called root causes behind its war against Ukraine, as if it were somehow forced to act. But this is a false narrative. Russia made a deliberate choice to invade a sovereign nation, an unprovoked act in blatant violation of international law. President, Ukraine and the Ukrainian people have shown themselves to have extraordinary reserves of courage to provide resistance. They have prevailed for over 3 years and 3 months. All peace-loving countries that value the rule of law, international law, including the UN Charter, must unite to support Ukraine's struggle, and there can be no justification for continuing material or political support to Russia. It must stop now. This war must end. Not only is Ukraine's freedom and independence at stake, the credibility and integrity of the international system and this very institution is at stake. The neo-imperial and colonial ambitions of Russia have no place in the 21st century. We reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, and will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, as we hopefully move closer towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace based on the UN Charter and international law. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Iceland for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations. Please.
Mr. President, the candidate countries Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco, and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. President, the EU reiterates its resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter. I would like to thank DPPA and OCHA for their clear statements on the consequences of this war of aggression against Ukraine, and for their critical efforts in leading the United Nations political and humanitarian engagement in Ukraine. Colleagues, after countless Council meetings to address Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, where we have each repeated our core concerns and messages time and again, we should all be able to agree on at least one thing now, that a full and unconditional ceasefire is what is needed now as a necessary condition for meaningful peace discussions. Many of us, many of you, have called repeatedly for a ceasefire on several occasions and in different formats. Many have done so while stressing the importance of an end to this war grounded in the UN Charter, international law, and respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity as applicable to all UN member states. Now is the time to make this a reality, end this illegal war and suffering, and achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter and international law. We welcome all efforts towards achieving such a peace. We, as Europeans, together with Ukraine, have been working tirelessly to this end. The European Union joins Ukraine, the United States, and other international partners in calling for a full and unconditional ceasefire of at least 30 days. This pause in hostilities would serve as a vital step towards reducing civilian suffering and allow for further exchanges of prisoners and the return of abducted children. It would also provide space for meaningful talks aimed at ending Russia's war of aggression and achieving a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Ukraine has repeatedly demonstrated its readiness to accept a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire without preconditions, committing to such a step months ago. President Zelensky traveled to Turkey for direct talks with Russia's president, which unfortunately never materialized. As has been the case from the beginning of this war, it is now for Russia to show its own willingness to achieve peace. To date, it has not done so. Last weekend, it launched its largest attack on Ukraine cities since the 2022 invasion, reportedly firing 355 drones and killing 13 people. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has noted the increase in civilian casualties resulting from Russia's aggression over the past months. In April, at least 209 civilians were killed and 1,146 injured. Russia's campaign of systematic airstrikes against Ukraine civilians and civilian critical infrastructure has not only not stopped, it has intensified. It violates international humanitarian law, undermines efforts for peace, and must finally stop now. Colleagues, we must all reiterate this message. All reiterate a continued support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders under the Charter. The EU will continue to support Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. The Council must exert full, principled, and effective diplomatic pressure for a full and unconditional ceasefire and for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. We implore you to do so immediately. Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Πρόεδρε. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. But don't go very far away. Stay in the vicinity, please.
Felicitaciones.